Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War Winter Assault for PC. This is the first expansion pack to Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War. It was developed by Relic and originally published by THQ in September of 2005, and eventually it was included with the original game in the Gold Edition of the game, and later compilations as well once they got the other expansion packs out. But this one features some changes from the original game. Nothing wildly different apart from adding in an entirely new race, in this case the Imperial Guard, as well as having two campaigns instead of just one. So the real question here is, how does this stack up as an expansion pack? Is it a worthy addition if you're a fan of Dawn of War and want more content, or is it just something you can pass on entirely? But before we answer that question, let's first talk about the presentation, which is pretty much exactly the same level of quality as the previous game, so this won't take very long. Basically, they just added in new content to fit the new faction, which is the Imperial Guard, as well as add in some new environments and such like that that are really just winter themed. There's not much to this thing in terms of its presentation that's a change from the previous, and the level of quality, like I said, is just as good as the original. So there's nothing really to worry about there. The same goes for the sound design. It's all just as good as the original, so there's not really much to say there. Voice acting's still delightfully over the top and ridiculous. The music's still certainly epic sounding, and the sound effects are still rather nice. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is split into two different campaigns. You have the Forces of Order campaign and the Campaign of Disorder. In the Forces of Order campaign, you choose to play as either the Imperial Guard or the Eldar, who run in basically parallel campaigns with different endings depending on which one you're playing. And the story is going to progress differently depending on which one you're playing as well. Should you decide to play as the Imperial Guard, you will be leading General Stern and the 412th Cadian on Lorne 5, and basically trying to take it back from the Chaos Space Marines and Orcs that are attacking it. And you're assisting the Ultramarines in attempting to get a Titan crew to a Titan that's on the planet, and thus basically demolish their foes. But the Eldar come in there and start messing things up for you, and you find out that they're there to also fight the spread of chaos and such like that. So it's sort of an uneasy truce between these two factions, where they basically just go, well, I'll put off fighting you because there's this bigger enemy of chaos and orcs. Gotta deal with them before we deal with each other. And so they deal with that, and depending on who you choose, again, the story's going to progress differently. And of course, if you choose the Imperial Guard, they're going to look more for themselves, and if you choose the Eldar, they're going to look for their own objectives. Meanwhile, should you choose to play on the Campaign of Disorder, you're either playing as the Chaos or the Orcs, and you're basically doing the exact opposite thing that the Imperial Guard or the Eldar are doing, and just trying to destroy them and take over the planet and things like that. And it gets a bit more complicated than that when Chaos and such find out about the Titan, and so really the plot kind of centers around that Titan and who's going to use it to demolish everybody else. So regardless of which campaign you're playing, the plot is actually pretty thin, and it really doesn't keep you going very long. In fact, I lost interest in the campaign within a couple of missions, regardless of which faction I was playing. Which means it really falls to the gameplay to bring this thing up, and luckily they didn't really water down the experience with this expansion pack. It's still the same Dawn of War that we played and loved, but they did change up a few things. Firstly, they introduced the new faction of the Imperial Guard, which is, unlike the others, a very vehicle-centric faction. Their actual infantry units are pretty weak, and they try to rely more on the strength and numbers kind of thing. But they have basically the best vehicles in the game, including the mighty Bane Blade, which is not only incredibly fun to say, but is also an incredibly powerful tank, and it will just absolutely demolish pretty much entire armies by itself. So you find pretty quickly that the Imperial Guard are almost overpowered, because you can get a lot of their units really fast, and once they get vehicles, they can pretty much steamroll the opposition. Now, if you know what you're doing, you can certainly fight against that, but of course if you don't know what you're doing, then that can become pretty problematic, and you'll find yourself getting rather annoyed with the game for having a surprisingly powerful faction in there. You would think of the Imperial Guard, if you know anything about the lore, as not being particularly powerful unless they have really, really large numbers, which is pretty much the case. but they can get those numbers very quickly. The other factions do not have that advantage, so you'll find that it's fairly easy for the Imperial Guard to overwhelm you pretty quickly unless you put up a pretty effective defense very early on. And this brings up a major point about this thing. They make you change up your tactics compared to the previous game. Obviously that makes sense because there's a new faction that plays pretty differently from the others, but at the same time they did quite a lot of rebalancing and tweaking on the original game's units. So you find that strategies that may have worked in base Dawn of War will not work necessarily in Winter Assault, because things have changed up considerably. For example, certain vehicles have been changed to being either anti-personnel or anti-vehicle rather than the ability to change to both. Or you've had significant changes in the way that certain units can upgrade so that they're much more limited and they focus much more narrowly on one specific thing, and thus you have to use other units to compensate for that. And so there's all these different changes that will certainly spice up the way you're playing and make you rethink all of your strategies, which is both a good thing and not necessarily a good thing. Because yes, it's nice that you had to change up your tactics, but you may or may not like some of the changes. And that's kind of the feeling I get with this expansion overall. Some people might like it, others won't. I didn't particularly care for it, but it's not a bad expansion. It's certainly nice to have another faction available, particularly the Imperial Guard, because, let's face it, they belong in a game like this. But the balancing changes didn't really click with me. So, ultimately, I have to give this a 3 out of 5. Again, it's not bad, but I wouldn't really consider it essential unless you just really want the Imperial Guard. Thanks for watching.